Brett McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. General George S. Patton is known for his aggressive, action-oriented tactical brilliance. His character was also marked by a lesser-known but equally fundamental mystic piety. Those two qualities would come together in the lead-up to and execution of Patton's greatest achievement during World War II, the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Alex Kershaw tells the story in his new book, Patton's Prayer, a true story of courage, faith, and victory in World War II. Today on the show, Alex shares how, when the Third Army's advance into Germany was stalled by plane grounding clouds and road money and rain, Patton commissioned a prayer for better weather that was distributed to 250,000 of his men, and how that prayer became even more urgent after the commencement of the Battle of the Bulge. We also talk about Patton's qualities as a leader and a man, including his reading habits, how he combined a profane assertiveness with a pious faith and a belief in reincarnation, and what happened to him as the war came to a close. After the show's over, check out our show notes at AoM.is/Patton. All right, Alex Kershaw, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you.
So we had you on at the end of last year to talk about one of your older books, that's The Longest Winter, which recounts the story of an 18-man U.S. platoon that faced the thrust of the entire German assault at the Battle of the Bulge. You got a new book out, and it's about the Battle of the Bulge as well, but this time it's about General George Patton's role in rebuffing the Nazis' last-ditch assault on the Allies, and it's called Patton's Prayer. And we'll get to the title of the book here in a bit because there was an actual prayer that Patton had composed for his troops. But before we do that, let's talk about Patton the man first. This guy, he was a larger-than-life character. He had ivory-handled pistols that he carried around, the shiny helmet, riding boots, had all these pithy quotes about driving and putting people's heads in meat grinders and calling everybody sons of bitches. What's Patton's background? What was his family background, and how did it shape who he became as a man?
Well, he had a very patrician background, not from New England, but California. He was a California aristocrat in many ways, and went to VMI and then West Point, and was a hell of a character. I mean, his formative years, I guess, after West Point were spent alongside people like Eisenhower, and he was a cavalryman above all. Actually competed in the 1912 Olympics for the one of the events. He had created his own sword, and famously in 1918 he commanded the first ever American tank unit, and that was in France. Took to combat with great relish. It was very brave, almost killed. Wrote, I think it was on his birthday, toward the end of the war, he said that it would be a shame for hostilities to end because he was enjoying it so much. He wanted a few more scraps. So this guy was a natural born warrior, very much larger than life, deeply religious, believed in reincarnation, thought that he'd fought in several wars before, that he was a man of destiny, and that something big was going to happen in his life eventually where he would be truly tested. And the point of my book is that big thing did happen. It was called the Battle of the Bulge, or rather World War II, but certainly during the Battle of the Bulge, he performed magnificently. He was an extraordinary force.
Well, so you mentioned that he was deeply spiritual, and you also talk about how he was actually incredibly intellectual. I think oftentimes we think of Patton as this unthinking brute. He just had a bloodlust, and that was it. But he was extremely well-read and thoughtful. And as a kid, he really struggled with reading in school. He probably had what we call today, he probably had dyslexia, probably had ADHD, and it really frustrated him. Because as a boy, he had this driving ambition even then to be this, consummate warrior in both body and mind. And so he became this voracious reader as a young man. He read the classics. He read, lots of biographies about past generals. And during World War II, he kept his reading up. Like, he had this extensive field library that he brought with him that had, books like the Bible and a prayer book, going to his spirituality. But then he had things like the complete set of Rudyard Kipling's poems, and something he read a lot was the Caesar's Commentaries.
Yeah, he never stopped studying military history, and I have a quote in the book where he explains to a journalist that as he was crossing Normandy, he was reading, Julius Caesar, and he said, I followed in the path of Julius Caesar because the guy knew what he was doing, and why not just copy the greats? And so, literally, there were quite a few times in World War II when Patton would trace the route of Julius Caesar a couple of thousand years before and follow it. He very much had a sense of his place in history, and he relished the fact that he was fighting in North Africa, he was fighting in Sicily, that he was determined to become the first Allied general to reach Messina, which is at the far eastern end of Sicily. He wanted to beat Montgomery, the British general, to that because he wanted his name in the history books. And I'd say that throughout World War II, he had an eye on making his name and going down in history as much as he did on defeating the enemy. And believe me, he really was highly aggressive when it came to trying to defeat Nazism. But yeah, it's a good point because people when you watch the famous movie about Patton, you just think he's this screaming maniac. I think that's kind of the takeaway. Although the movie is really pretty accurate, and I think George C. Scott does a fantastic job. I think it's probably his best role. He turned down the Oscar. Actually, Scott complained at the time when the movie was being made that it wasn't accurate enough. He read hugely about Patton, and he said that Patton wasn't being rendered as a complex enough figure, as a figure who had deep emotions and was, profoundly religious and was a hugely complex man, and as well as being an intellect. So one of the things that really drew me to Patton was that he was an intellect that I don't think there was anybody in the Allied Supreme Command, an army commander, certainly, who was as well versed in military history as Patton. He read everything he could. He read the enemy's works too. He studied tank warfare because he read German theorists. So he was a polymath in many ways, a man of immense culture and really great education.
Yeah. Well, I know maybe something that separated him and Eisenhower. I know in Eisenhower, when he had time off, he would read, but it would be like a Louis L'Amour, like a Western.
Yeah, he would read Western novels for relaxation.
Right.
Whereas Patton's there reading Julius Caesar and the Greeks and medieval history.
Yeah.
It's funny because if you look at the route of the Third Army, because he ended up commanding the Third Army famously, and if you look at the route of the Third Army from Normandy all the way to the Czechoslovakian border, Czech border now, often he's following in the footsteps of the Romans, and he loved that. He loved the fact that when his army crossed the Rhine, it was the first time for a very long time, for many centuries, that an invading force had crossed the Rhine, and he loved the idea that he was making that kind of history.
Yeah, and he decided to mark the occasion by peeing in the Rhine.
Yeah, yeah. In the book, you'll see several pictures about that period, and it's still debatable whether the famous photograph of Patton peeing in the Rhine, whether that's actually accurate or not. But I have no reason, I've come across no evidence to suggest that he didn't urinate in the Rhine. And that would be a very fitting thing for Patton to do, very Patton-esque.
Yeah. So this is a guy, very intellectual. He saw himself on the same stage as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. Like he had an epic view of himself inside of history. You mentioned his spiritual life. We'll talk about the reincarnation here in a bit, but what was his spiritual life like? He was Anglican, correct?
Yeah. And he was a practicing Anglican. He went to church regularly, attended services, prayed every day, as far as I can make out. In his diaries would write messages to his Lord, He was very devout, more so than any other American army commander, more so than any Allied commander that I came across in World War II. He truly did believe that he was doing God's work and that he was going to be protected by God and that God was going to answer his prayers. So he was pious and religious. The great contradiction, and I guess if I think this through, I don't know whether it is a great contradiction, in fact, because people say, here's this guy that's God-fearing, and yet he swears, blasphemes, and is the most notorious user of goddamn and the rest of it in World War II. The opening speech that you see in that great movie, Patton, is actually not one speech, but it's cobbled together from 3 or 4 speeches that Patton actually made. So although he didn't have that full-on amazing rant as he did in the movie, George C. Scott's speech is actually taken from several that Patton made. And he did swear a lot. I mean, he swore famously, he turned the air blue. And the instances where I found him to be most vocal, I don't think they're anywhere near what he actually was like. This was a guy that, could use swear words in a very inventive way. So I would not have liked to be at the end of one of his tirades. Needless to say, there would have been a lot of effing and blinding, as us Brits say.
And I think it does make sense if you think of Patton as sort of embodying this warrior archetype like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. These guys, had a bloodlust. They were aggressive and they fought, but they were pious. They made their sacrifices before they went out before they went out to war.
And just because you swear a lot doesn't mean that you're not devout.
Yeah.
God forbid that people who swore would not be regular church attenders.
Yeah, they probably need it the most, right?
We wouldn't have many people going to church.
Yeah, exactly. Well, tell us about this reincarnation, because I've read that about him, that he believed that he was reincarnated, that he actually saw great battles from history.
Yeah, that again, without referencing too much the movie, there's those famous scenes when he's in North Africa I think Sicily, where he's wandering around and he looks at the ruins of previous battles, and he genuinely believed that he had many lives, and in several of those lives he'd been a warrior in times gone past. So yeah, he absolutely did believe in reincarnation. He'd been reincarnated several times already, so I don't know which life he was on, but it wasn't number one, put it that way.
And you also talk about he thought he was a man of destiny. Like, he really thought Providence, God, had saved him for this period to take part in this great enterprise. And I've seen connections between him and Winston Churchill. Like, Winston Churchill talked the same way about himself. He's like, I'm a man of destiny. I was born for this.
Yeah. Well, I think I make the parallel in the book where I point out that Churchill said that he'd walked with destiny, beside destiny, most of his life. And then, at age 65, suddenly becomes Prime Minister in May 1940, at the most critical point in modern British history, where, Britain basically stood alone against a Nazi onslaught. And, Churchill believed that his whole life had prepared him for that ordeal, that trial, that moment. And Patton was similar. He wasn't 65, but he was nearing 60. During the Battle of the Bulge, he was 59 years old. He just turned 59. So not far off Churchill, but he definitely felt that he'd been waiting much of his 20s, 30s, 40s, and into his 50s to really seize the moment, seize the day, and become what he was destined to become, which was, in my view, the most effective American combat commander of World War II.
So Patton famously led the Third Army. What was the Third Army's role in World War II prior to the Battle of the Bulge?
Well, the Third Army was activated at the beginning of August 1944. So we were about to break out of Normandy. A lot of the really heavy, bloody fighting had been done in Normandy. And the Third Army under Patton was brought into play and basically led the American breakout from Normandy, and did so in extraordinary style and speed. The spearhead of the Third Army was the 4th Armored Division. That was Patton's favored division, hell on wheels. And they cut a slash across France that was extraordinary. There were stories about how tank commanders would call up Patton and ask where they should rest for the night to refuel, etc. And Patton said, what the hell are you doing calling me? You're wasting time even picking up a field phone. Just keep moving. Don't stop. And so the Third Army in the summer of 1944 took more prisoners and traveled further than any other mobile force in history in basically about 6 weeks, all the way from Brittany right to within 100 miles of the German border. It was the only thing that stopped Patton was lack of fuel and to some extent the weather, but it was mainly the lack of fuel to supply his armored divisions. It was a very potent force. Patton had studied German strategy and tactics and the Blitzkrieg that had been so effective in 1940, and he basically developed an American form of Blitzkrieg, a very Patton-esque version of it, which basically meant that he equipped, manned, and planned for his armored units to act as really effective modern-day cavalry, flanked by infantry divisions, etc. But his main preoccupation was speed and movement and taking the fight to the enemy and never allowing them, if possible, to have a break. Constant pressure. Just keep pushing. He several times gave instructions which were basically don't worry about what's going on 10 miles to the east or the west. Just keep pushing ahead and fight. Just keep fighting. And it proved to be very effective until you get into the late fall of 1944, where the weather became atrocious. Fuel supplies were very difficult. It's very hard to come across extra fuel, and there was a manpower problem. So, yeah, he was a genius of armored warfare.
Yeah. And so Patton, the Third Army, makes this slash into Europe, but then in the fall of 44, they get stymied. The weather's bad. There's no manpower. They're out of fuel. But yeah, the weather becomes a problem as you get into November, December. And this is when the title of your book comes into play, Patton's Prayer. Patton decided he says, we got to pray. And he had this great quote talking about Patton's idea about what role prayer played in warfare. He says, you got to plan, then you got to work really hard, but then you have to pray really hard as well. So he goes and finds this chaplain to say, I want you to write a prayer for us. So tell us about this chaplain who wrote Patton's Prayer.
That was a guy called O'Neill. He was the senior chaplain in the Third Army, and I believe there were more than 20 denominations within the Third Army, but he was the overall chief. And on the 8th of December 1944, while Patton was headquartered in Nancy in France, O'Neill was at his desk one morning and he received a call, and it was Patton. O'Neill came from Chicago. I think he was 52 years old at the time. And he's a Roman Catholic priest. But he receives this call from Patton saying, come and see me. And when he went to see him, Patton said, look, I want you to write a prayer for me, which was, came as a big surprise to O'Neill. And the prayer was basically for good weather. And I can read a little bit of it.
Yeah.
It was printed onto over 250,000 prayer cards, so that basically every guy in the Third Army received one. And I think the last of these prayer cards, which, it's like a business card. I've actually got one. It fits into your wallet nicely. It would fit into any GI's combat pocket neatly. And the last of those prayers was distributed on the 14th of December, 1944. And that's a hell of a lot of copies of a prayer and a hell of a lot of people to receive them. But anyway, on one side, there was a Christmas message that O'Neill wrote on behalf of Patton. And then the main prayer on the other side of the card read like this: Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee that, armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. So that was the prayer, and Patton was very pleased with it. And in my book, I go into quite some detail. But O'Neill recorded the conversation he had with Patton in quite some detail, and I shamelessly used a lot of the dialogue from O'Neill's memoirs for that meeting between the two of them on the 8th of December 1944. So yeah, Patton made some good points though when he was talking to O'Neill. He asked O'Neill, how much praying was being done, and O'Neill said that it was pretty difficult to find places for people to pray as a congregation, and that in the middle of a war it was difficult to hold services, but basically not a lot of praying was going on. And Patton said, well, we need to change that. And Patton said, up to now in the Third Army, this is up until December of 1944. God has been very good to us. We have never retreated. We have never suffered defeats. This is because a lot of people back home are praying for us. We were lucky in Africa, in Sicily, and in Italy, simply because people prayed. But we have to pray for ourselves too. And I love this about Patton. He added that a good soldier, quote, a good soldier is not made merely by making him think and work. There is something in every soldier that goes deeper than thinking or working. It's his guts. It is something that he has built up in there. It is a world of truth and power that is higher than himself. And Patton basically told O'Neill that everybody in the Third Army should be praying all the time. And if they didn't pray, sooner or later they'd crack up, as he said, go insane or go to pieces. And so O'Neill not only wrote a Christmas message from Patton, plus the famous Patton's prayer for good weather, he also issued a directive in Patton's name that actually went to, unbelievably, 486 chaplains in the Third Army, 32, I'm correcting myself now, 32 denominations, and the officers of 20 divisions that were under Patton's command. And the directive was really precise. Pray when driving, pray when fighting, pray alone, pray with others, pray by night and pray by day, pray for the cessation of immoderate rains, for good weather for battle, pray for victory, pray for our army, and pray for peace, lastly.
We're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. And now back to the show. So Patton, he has his prayer issued. He hands it out. At the same time, Hitler's planning his attack, right? This is like a last-ditch effort. We talked about this in our last conversation. Secret attack. No one knew it was coming. The Allies were caught completely off guard. How did Patton respond? Like, what was his response when he found out that the Nazis had made this surprise attack?
Well, you say that nobody knew that it was going to happen, and that's true to the extent that no one knew the extent of the German attack. No one knew that there were going to be over 200,000 troops involved and that this was Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. But in fact, Patton did know that something was going to happen because he had a superb intelligence staff. His entire staff were first class, but he had a head of intelligence called Oskar Kosch, who he'd worked with since 1942. And he trusted him hugely. He didn't ever make a major decision without consulting Kosch. And Kosch, in late November and early December of 1944, had received a lot of intelligence, field intelligence, etc., interrogations of POWs, which suggested that the Germans were building up a significant force to the north of the Third Army near the Ardennes. And so Patton, when he was told about this, he gave orders to make preparations in case there was a significant attack further north. And so when the attack finally came on the 16th of December, stunning and shocking the Allied command, and Patton himself was surprised by just how many men and how many tanks the Germans had been able to bring into play without anybody really realizing it. But when it happened, when the disaster unfolded, Patton was the only guy with a plan. In fact, he had 3 plans because he'd consulted with Kosch and had asked his staff to draw up preparations in the likelihood of such a large-scale movement of German forces. He had no idea that it was going to be so vast, so big, that the Germans would punch almost 70 miles through past Allied lines. But he did have a plan in place, and it was that plan that one of those 3 operational plans that he adopted in the early days of the Battle of the Bulge. There was a famous meeting of Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, and other senior staff at Verdun, a fitting place given what had happened there in World War I, on the 19th of December. And Patton stole the show. He was the only guy in the meeting that actually was confident, that saw this as a real opportunity to finish off the Wehrmacht, and he had a plan. He was the only guy with a plan, and said that he could pivot his Third Army in 48 hours and move that Third Army over 100 miles to the north, to the Ardennes, and then counterattack. And the reaction, particularly from one British senior official at Verdun, was laughter. This guy's joking. This guy really is a maniac. But and Eisenhower himself said, it was somewhat surprised by Patton's plan and said, well, don't go off half-cocked, take a little bit more time than that. But in fact, Patton did only really need 48 hours and did actually pivot his entire Third Army in just over 2 days, which is that act of changing the axis of advance of an entire army in such a short period of time and then moving over 100 miles in terrible winter conditions was the greatest achievement of Patton's illustrious military career. It was a phenomenal achievement.
Yeah, because he had a plan, even though he didn't know exactly what was going to happen, he had a plan. It allowed him to execute with speed. Again, it just allowed him to be fast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Action was what was required, and he knew that the German forces were overextending themselves. They were vulnerable, but what it took was someone to act quickly and with immense aggression and to take the fight to the enemy. And, the reason why the Battle of the Bulge is known as the Battle of the Bulge is not because of any Weight Watchers. It's because if you looked at a map certainly on the 18th or 19th of December of 1944, it would show a big bulge in the Allied lines. And Patton, when he looked at that bulge, he saw opportunity. He thought, well, if I can cut off the spearhead of the Wehrmacht, if I can attack, we can take great advantage of this. What others saw as a crisis, he saw as an opportunity. And I think that he not only saw it as an opportunity to defeat the Wehrmacht decisively, but he saw it as a way to shorten the war. That if we did the right things, we threw enough men into this battle, if he was given the right kind of command, if he was allowed to make the decisions that he wanted to make, then this could be the last great battle of the war. It ended up being the last great battle on the Western Front anyway, but he thought that German collapse would soon follow. It actually took 4 months after the conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge in late January of 1945. It took until the 7th of May 1945 for the Third Reich to finally collapse. But, it was speeded up by defeat in the Battle of the Bulge.
And you do such a great job in this part of the book talking about this drive that Patton was making with the Third Army. They're trying to reach Bastogne, and you do a great job of showing the leadership style of Patton. Like, he was one who led from the front. And he actually talked about it. He said, it's important for my men to see me at the front. And it's also important that the enemy sees me at the front, because he understood the power of presence. He understood the power of having an image, and that it could inspire his own men, but also strike fear in the enemy. You recount this. There's points where, Germans talk about, oh my gosh, where's Patton? Is Patton here? Like, they start freaking out when they hear that Patton's on his way. And talking about this theatrical aspect of Patton's leadership style, you do this great quote when he got asked about it in the press, and he started talking about it. And he was very self-aware of it. He said, you quote this, I like this a lot. He says, people ask why I swagger and swear, wear flashy uniforms, and sometimes 2 pistols. Well, I'm not sure whether some of it is any of my own damn fault, but however that may be, the press and others have built a picture of me. So now, no matter how tired or discouraged or even really ill I may be, if I don't live up to that picture, my men are going to say, the old man's sick. The old son of a bitch has had it. Then their own confidence, their own morale will take a big drop. So you could see him. Like, there's instances where he would help, push a truck out of the snow. That was really important for the men to see that.
Yeah, definitely. If you're in the battle of your life and things are really, really tough, it's nice to see that the big boss, lending a hand. One of the things that I love about Patton is the fact that he walked it as he talked it. I mean, he talked big, but he walked big, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And, in contrast to someone like Bradley, who was the so-called GI's general, that was a myth propagated by Ernie Pyle, who wrote a bunch of columns about Bradley, eulogizing him. Bradley barely left his hotel in Luxembourg throughout the Battle of the Bulge, whereas Patton was out there almost every single day, for sometimes all day, in open armored jeep, visiting division commanders, corps commanders, and being seen by countless of his men. And there are so many examples and so many instances of guys under his command actually spotting him as he passed by in a jeep, and he would stand up and shout out encouragement and, swear and say that they had the Germans nuts in a grinder, et cetera, et cetera. You can only imagine. Yeah. But the fact was that he was there, he was seen, and he was seen at the front pushing his Third Army towards victory. And I think that says everything you need to know about Patton, that he was a man that was there and led from the front, was seen at the front, and knew how important it was to be regarded that way by his troops.
Yeah.
He was very strict. He was a disciplinarian.
Oh yeah, he's a big stickler for that sort of thing.
Very, very loyal. I mean, everybody complained in the Third Army that they all had to wear neckties, that their helmets had to be polished, whatever. That it was seemed to be this sort of ridiculous level of neatness that Patton required. But that was part of a broader philosophy that Patton had, which was that he did demand discipline, that he wanted men to be extremely well trained, to do what they were told, to perform at a very high level. And that came through discipline.
Yeah.
You need great discipline in a great army. And they might have bitched and moaned about it, but after the war, when they look back, they were all proud to have served under old blood and guts. They realized that kind of order and discipline and pride of unit mattered a great deal.
Did Patton's prayer get answered? Like the weather clear up eventually?
Yeah, it did. And Patton certainly believed that it was answered, and other men in the Third Army believed that it had been answered. And the main answer came, the answer came on 22nd of December when the weather started to change. And then on the morning of the 23rd, Patton awoke and looked out of his headquarters in Luxembourg up at the sky, and it was bright blue. So the cloud cover and fogs and mists that had shrouded the Wehrmacht and shrouded the battlefield since the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, the 16th of December, that finally all went away. And the point was that with clear skies, the Allied air forces could go to town, and they had air superiority, massive air superiority, and could do a hell of a lot of damage, but they couldn't do that with low cloud cover and mist and fog. In fact, they'd been grounded until that point. But with clear skies on the 23rd of December, they pounded everything they could find between the Rhine and the Ardennes. They hit columns of German tanks. They strafed and pounded and bombed and shelled and you name it, and did a hell of a lot of damage and made the critical difference in the Battle of the Bulge. So when Patton looked up at the clear blue skies, he absolutely believed that his prayer had been answered. And then soon after, he called for his chaplain, O'Neill, his head chaplain, O'Neill, and he gave him a medal. He's the only chaplain in World War II that we know of that received a medal for writing a prayer. I think it was a Bronze Star.
Yeah.
You know? So
that's very Patton-esque.
And Patton pinned it onto himself. He wasn't just handed it by some underling. It was Patton who pinned the medal on him himself. You know.
All right, so they make it to Bastogne, and like this is kind of the Battle of the Bulge started winding down. It took a few more weeks for it to happen. What happened to the Third Army after that? Like, what did they do?
Well, Bastogne was relieved on the 26th of December, but actually in the first couple of weeks of January of 1945, there were much higher casualties suffered by the Third Army, and in fact by the 101st Airborne, than from the 16th of December through to the end of 1944, because it's one thing to stop a German counterattack and to relieve a besieged town. It's quite another thing to push the Wehrmacht back to their starting point. And that took most of January of 1945, and it was a very bloody ordeal indeed, because the Germans fought very, very hard. They knew they had their backs to their homeland. Finally, the two key armies involved in the Battle of the Bulge met up at a place called Houffalize, and the Americans pipped the Brits to Houffalize by just a matter of a few hours. And so that was the join-up of the two main armies involved on the Allied side in the battle. And from there until the end of January, from Houffalize until the end of January, it was a slugging match to push the Germans back to where they'd started from on day one of the Battle of the Bulge. They took a break for a while, and then by early February, the Third Army was on the move. Its progress was relatively slow through February, again because of the winter conditions and determined German counterattacks and stubbornness, But then finally by March, they're starting to move. They've broken the back of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, and they're moving towards the Rhine. The Allies crossed the Rhine first on the 7th of March, 1945, across the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, and then through the rest of March, the rest of the Allied armies crossed the Rhine from north to south. Patton crossed the Rhine on the 25th of March near Oppenheim, and famously urinated in the river and got to the other side, to the eastern banks of the Rhine, and fell to his knees and grabbed a bunch of dirt and shouted out, "Thus William the Conqueror." Basically, and that this is we were talking earlier on about his understanding of military history and his love for those who'd come before. So only Patton would have dropped to his knees on the other side of the Rhine and invoked William the Conqueror. So that takes you to April of 1945. Once we were across the Rhine, that was the last natural barrier between us and Berlin. You go Siegfried Line, and then the Rhine, and then that's it. Basically, there was still a lot of heavy fighting going on, but it was all over really for the Third Reich on the Western Front.
And Patton he was a celebrity. He became a hero. Like, everyone loved Patton.
Oh yeah, I mean, his name was in the headlines through much of the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, he became a superstar.
Eventually, so Patton's not fighting as much. There's still some fighting going on, but he starts getting into trouble. And eventually he gets in a lot of trouble, and he got relieved from his command of the Third Army. What caused that?
He hated the Soviets. That was the main reason, and he spoke out about it unwisely. And time again, just couldn't keep his mouth shut. And basically said that we should carry on fighting, and that rather than the Nazis, we should be fighting the Red Army. It's not what people wanted to hear. Certainly not what Eisenhower or any politicians wanted to hear after we'd won.
When I read that, I thought he kind of has a point. He said, like, we got to probably fight these guys, because if we don't, we'll be fighting them in 20 years. And like, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it was called the Cold War, but that looming conflict was pretty hot even in 1945,
Yeah.
And that, if you ask somebody that lived throughout the Cold War or was in the part of Eastern Europe that was occupied by the Red Army, they certainly didn't regard themselves as being liberated. And Patton insisted on trying to get to Prague and was stopped. He was told, no, you got to stop. We've agreed at Yalta, these are the lines that we're going to finish with at the end of the war. Stalin gets this, we occupy this, and that's it. And Patton wanted to go as far as he could, as fast as he could. And the reason why was because he knew that he was a liberator, not a conqueror, that he wanted to set people free rather than enslave them, which is what he believed the Soviets would do and did do. So in terms of identifying the Soviets as the main enemy of democracy in Europe, he was dead right, but that was not the time to do it when over 19 million European civilians lay dead, and we'd gone through a horrific global conflict. It was just, not what people wanted to hear. And it's not what his men wanted to hear either, to be honest. All they could think about in 1945 was going home, and they didn't want to stay in Europe and fight against a formidable Red Army. That would have been a horrific bloodbath.
Yeah. So Eisenhower, he was thinking about the ally. He was thinking about relationships and trying to figure out how we're going to organize this post-war thing.
Yeah.
He's thinking bigger picture, and Patton's comments weren't helping that. And so, he basically got sacked from his.
Yeah, he didn't get sacked for comments about the Soviets, although those were very impolitic, and it's surprising that he wasn't disciplined severely. He got sacked eventually because Eisenhower ran out of patience. And the reason why he ran out of patience finally was that in a press conference, Patton had been set up by a journalist, and Patton was pretty easy to set up. You just asked him a question about the Red Army, or you asked him a question that would set Patton off. And one of the questions was seemingly benign, and it was basically about his role after the end of the war, which was that he was the governor of occupied Bavaria, and it was his responsibility to, put that shattered part of Germany back together and make it run and organize things. It was an army of occupation that he was commanding, and he was asked a question about the treatment of Nazi officials, and Patton basically pointed out that if you didn't allow any Nazi official back into government, if you didn't allow some of them to run the show and, to make the electricity work, to organize various things, to run towns and cities, then who were you left with? Because pretty much anybody that had been in power of any kind since the rise of Hitler had been in the Nazi Party. You had to be in the Nazi Party to be a senior government official anywhere in Germany. That's what it was all about. And so Patton basically said, well, the Nazis aren't that different to the Republicans and the Democrats. It's like if you belong to them, it's not that much different to being in the Nazi party. And of course, that comparison of the Republicans and Democrats to the Nazis just, lit a bonfire. That was a step too far. Even though when you really think about it, what Patton was saying was pretty true, And as we learned, to our great dismay, but not a lot of people's shock in some parts of the world, when we invaded Iraq, there was no real plan for what we were going to do once we'd invaded, and just a lot of idealism. And, when we got rid of Saddam Hussein's forces and his senior command structure, etc., and all those who had obeyed Saddam Hussein, you were left with a vacuum. You didn't have anybody to turn to help you organize our occupation of Iraq. And Patton was basically saying the same thing. You need to find people who can actually run the show. Otherwise, we're going to have to do it all, and we can't do it all on our own.
How did he respond to his getting removed from command?
Well, you have to remember that Eisenhower's patience had been tested since 1943 with the famous slapping incident, and there were several other occasions since then that had caused him a lot of irritation. He basically just wanted Patton to keep his goddamn mouth shut. And, when they finally met, it was in September of 1945 in Europe, in Germany, and they had a real ding-dong. I mean, a meeting went on for about 2 hours. Voices were raised. Eisenhower's assistant and driver, a woman called Kay Summersby, wrote in a memoir that this was the most annoyed that she'd ever seen Eisenhower, that he'd aged like 10 years during this whole episode when he was having to, basically fire a good friend. And that was what, Patton was. And he basically relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, which was a stunning blow to Patton. When Patton left the meeting, an observer said that he was white, maybe with shock, but certainly with disappointment. And he was given sort of a bogus role as head of the 15th Army, which is basically was going to write the history of World War II as an historical unit. So it was a real come down from, at the end of the war, Patton had almost 500,000 Americans under his command as Third Army commander, and then to suddenly find himself in charge of a bunch of guys who were going to write the history of World War II was a real demotion. And it hit him hard. He pretended that it didn't, in public anyway, but, it left him somewhat embittered, deeply saddened, and wondering about what the hell he was going to do with the rest of his life, because his glory days were definitely over.
Yeah.
The problem for Patton was that even then, when the war ended in Europe on the 7th of May, 1945, he wanted to go to Japan. He was all for it. And in fact, he visited Washington, D.C. in June of 1945, and he was on a mission to try and get sent to Japan. At his last meeting with his Third Army staff, he said, "I'll see you in China." So he was all up for even more of a war. But MacArthur, who was the king of the Pacific Theater, he wouldn't have Patton anywhere near him. I think he was threatened by Patton. It certainly didn't want that size ego anywhere near him. And so there was no role found for Patton in the Pacific, even though Patton had actually asked President Truman when he was at the White House in June of 1945 to send him there. It wasn't going to happen because MacArthur wouldn't allow it, basically. And so it raises a question about what would have happened to Patton had he not died in a car accident in December 1945. So yeah, he was a man without a real role or purpose, or as he saw it, a future, and it hurt him a great deal. He'd devoted his entire life to the U.S. Army.
Yeah, that car accident, it was a pretty banal death for Patton. I don't think it was the death that he thought he'd have, like this glorious warrior death. So yeah, it's the end of 1945. He's about to leave Europe. He's thinking about retiring from the Army. And he gets in this dumb car accident. Everyone else was fine, but he ended up being paralyzed from the neck down. He had to spend, I think, 12 days in spinal traction in a hospital. But even during that time, he was he was a stoic soldier. The nurses said he was the ideal patient, but he said, "Yeah, this is a hell of a way to die." And he ended up dying from those injuries from that car accident. What's interesting, though, is that Patton had a clear premonition of his death several months before. So he went back to the United States for leave. And while he was there, right before he went back to Europe, he told his family, "This is our last goodbye." And they were like, what are you talking about? Like, the war's over. You're not going to die. But he knew he was going to die soon because he believed you had a certain amount of protection from Providence or a certain amount of luck, and his had run out. But he did think he would be reincarnated again. So after writing this book, did you take any life lessons from Patton?
Yeah, that's a great question. The one thing that I came to realize by looking at Patton is that, today he would be totally ostracized. He wouldn't stand a chance in the modern US military. He was too outspoken. He wasn't a team player in some ways. But if you look at human history, if you look at in detail at human history, a lot of it is about conflict. Modern history is the history of war in many ways, one war after another. And we would be very naive to assume that we're not going to stay that way as a basically conflictual species. And we need people like Patton. We're always going to need figures like Patton in the future. If we face great military tests, we're going to need aggressive, brilliant commanders who want to win and are prepared to do whatever they can to win. You don't want to have your hands tied behind your back in a war if the stakes are everything. If national survival is on the line, you're out to win. And from my point of view, men like Patton, we've always needed them, and we'll always need them in the future.
Well, Alex, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the book and your work?
You can go to all the usual online bookstores, and you can also go to my website, alexkershaw.com. You can follow me on Twitter. Yeah, the book's published on the 21st of May, and hopefully people will enjoy it. I had a great time writing it because I got to write about an incredibly fun, fascinating, colorful figure, which is Patton.
Yeah, I had a great time reading it. It's a great book.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Alex Kershaw, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, mate. Thanks a lot.
My guest today is Alex Kershaw. He's the author of the book Patton's Prayer. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find more information about his work at his website, alexkershaw.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/Patton, where you find links to resources and we delve deeper into this topic. Well, that wraps up another edition of the AoM Podcast. Make sure to check out our website at artofmanliness.com, where you can find our podcast archives, as well as thousands of articles that we've written over the years about pretty much anything you think of. And if you haven't done so already, I'd appreciate it if you take 1 minute to give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps out a lot. And if you've done that already, thank you. Please consider sharing the show with a friend or family member who you think will get something out of it. As always, thank you for the continued support. And until next time, it's Brett McKay, reminding you to not listen to the AoM Podcast, but put what you've heard into action.